Hi, my name is Jake, and I am a bookish drummer. So for this video, it's essentially the exact opposite of my previous video, which was 7 fantasy books that instantly hooked me into the story. This video is all about the 7 fantasy books that took a little while to get into. The previous video was all about the fantasy books that I read that instantly hooked me into the story from the very first chapter or from the very first prologue. I read them and I very much wanted to continue with the story as quickly as possible. These fantasy books, on the other hand, these 70, good lord. These fantasy books, on the other hand, these 7 fantasy books, they took a little bit of getting into, they took a little bit of getting used to, and none of these books are bad books. In fact, some of these books are from some of my favorite fantasy series of all time. So that's just a lesson in patience. Patience is a virtue. Sometimes, books aren't all fireworks, from the very first chapter. You gotta wait it out a little bit, and then it gets good. And this is especially true for fantasy books because not only are you introduced to a lot of characters, you're also introduced to this brand new world and what the world looks like, what these people are doing, their cultures, and a lot of the times the magic system. The author has a lot to impact, and sometimes it can be very hard to concisely do that in the opening chapter. Sometimes you take, several chapters, maybe even like 100 pages to just get used to it. Or a lot of the times it can just be the writing style. An author might have a unique way of writing the story, and it can sometimes take the reader a little bit of getting used to their writing style. So for these 7 fantasy books, they definitely took a little bit of getting used to, but once you get into it, they're actually pretty good, and a lot of these books are a part of my favorite fantasy series. But anyway, enough of the preamble, let's go ahead and jump right into it. And I'm going to go ahead and start out with my all-time favorite fantasy series, which is A Song of Ice and Fire, and the first book being A Game of Thrones. The first time I tried to read this was a little weird, I'll be honest. The writing style was very different from what I was used to. I watched the first 4 seasons, and after that I wanted to jump into the books to figure out what happens after that. And jumping into this book, like I said, the writing style is unique and very jarring, especially the first time you read it. But once you get used to the writing style, it's so good. And obviously, it's my favorite fantasy series, duh. And I can only imagine the people who first read this book way back in the 90s and even in the 2000s, before the TV show came out. They had to learn all these names of people and places, and they probably had no idea how to pronounce any of them. And the writing style on top of that, it must have been a very jarring way to jump into this fantasy world. So it definitely takes a little bit of getting used to, but once you get into it, it's very good, and the characters are great. Some of the best character work I've ever seen in any book I've ever read. So even though this is my all-time favorite fantasy series, the very first time I tried reading this, it definitely took a little bit of getting used to. But still, after that initial shock of, reading the first couple 100 pages, it quickly turned into one of my favorite fantasy series. Or actually, my favorite. And for this next book, I actually don't have this book. I really don't plan on continuing with the series anyway, so I don't have any of the books. But I'm going to talk about Malice, Book of the Fallen, the first book being Gardens of the Moon. Now, when I first tried reading this book, it took me several attempts. And the very first time I tried to read it, I maybe got like 20 pages in, and I was like, I'm going to stray away from this. And then the second time I tried to read it, I got a little bit further in. I tried to be a little bit more patient. and I probably got like 100 pages in. But still, I wasn't quite jiving with it. And then the third time, I eventually was just like, you know what, I know this book is dense, so I'm gonna stick with it. And I just kept pushing through. And then things started to make a little bit more sense the further I got into it. And while I don't plan on continuing with the series, when I read that book, I did like it. I gave it 4 stars. So it was definitely worth pushing through those first couple hundred pages where the writing style, again, was very weird, and it was unlike anything I had read at that point, and the author purposely kind of doesn't give you all of the information to make things make sense, and you really can't get a good grasp on what is happening until you get much deeper into the book. But once you do, things start to make more sense, and then it ends up being a good book. One thing that I forgot to mention is that there's kind of a theme for these 2 different types of books. So the 7 fantasy books that initially hooked me from the very first chapter, or for the prologue, they all tend to be more modern fantasy books. All of those books that I mentioned from my shaky recollection, I'm pretty sure are from the past decade or so. Whereas most of these books that I'm talking about here, books that take a little bit of getting used to, a lot of these are older books that were written before the year 2000. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I just believe that shows how writing styles change over time, especially like when you read classics, like those books can be really slow. And then even, books that were written in the 90s, like A Game of Thrones, that writing style is still pretty slow and takes a little bit of getting used to. Whereas these modern day writers, they pretty much want to, get your attention immediately. So for a lot of these books that I have that took a little bit of getting used to, they tend to be a little bit older books. And this book is no exception. This book was written around the mid-90s, and that would be Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb. This book is deliberately slow paced. It oftentimes moves at a snail's pace. And while that is true, it's still an intriguing read. It's very much more of a character book than a plot book, I would say. It does help that the first entry here is relatively short. It's about 400 pages, and then the second and the third books are quite longer. The chapters aren't extremely long, but they can be a little lengthy, and a lot of the times there's not too much going on in them, so it can be a little bit of a slow read. And for a lot of people, that pushes them off, and they want more of a fast-paced book, or at least a book with shorter chapters. But once you get further into the book, you quickly empathize with the main character, Fitz, and his story, and kind of how depressing his life is, and you want to, follow his life and see what he's going to be up to. And I think once you get further into the book, it gets, easier to read and a little bit more interesting. But it definitely has a little bit of a bumpy start. Another older fantasy book that's been recently translated into English is one of my all-time favorite fantasy series, and that would be the first book in the Witcher series, which would be The Last Wish by Andrzej Sapkowski. Technically, this is the first short story collection, and then the first, book is Blood of Elves, but this is basically the best starting point, so I like to just call this the first book. This book can be a bit jarring for fantasy readers, not just because of the writing style, but because of the fact that it's a short story collection. And most people, I would say, who are avid readers are more of novel readers, and they might like short stories, but for the most part, people like novels. But this is a short story collection, so it can be a little bit of a jarring read, because it can be a little bit chunky. That's probably not the right word, but I'm going to go with it. I love short stories, so that part didn't bother me. The writing style and getting used to the characters and sort of like the different kind of customs and the different creatures that are in here, that took a little bit of while of getting into. But I know for a lot of people, they start with this book and it's, 6 or 7 short stories, and it can be a little bit it can take a little while to get used to. In the writing style itself, what Andrei Sapkowski does a lot of the times is that he has pages and pages that is just dialogue, and that's a lot different than what most authors do. A lot of the times they'll have sections in between the dialogue to not have like literal pages and pages of dialogue. But that's not what Andrei Sapkowski does, and that can be a little bit jarring too. But like I've said, once you get used to it, it's very good, and then you jump into the second book, which is also another short story collection, Sword of Destiny, and he basically does the same thing, and that's one of my all-time favorite books ever. And so I believe that if you start with this book, and it is jarring, you still need to like push through it in order to really enjoy it. So all of those books were older books. I'm going to save the oldest book for last, and actually these next two books, they're more modern fantasy books, but they're still a little bit jarring getting into, and you definitely have to give it time to get invested into the story. The first one of those books is Sunderland Ascends by Josiah Bancroft, and this story, it does have a pretty intriguing start to it, where this guy travels to the Tower of Babel, and he loses his wife, and he basically, has to go find her. So that's an intriguing start. The reason why I include it on here is just because of the writing style. It's written less in like a modern fantasy way. Like, it's definitely not written like a Sanderson or a Sullivan. It's written more in a literary way, and that can throw off a lot of people. And for me, part one of this 3-part book was very weird. Each part is basically him ascending different levels to the tower. Part one was really weird, and for large chunks of it, I was like, what is even going on? But then you get to parts 2 and 3, and those parts are a little bit better, and then once you get to those parts, it just gets better and better. And then retroactively, things get a little bit more explained from part 1 as you get further and further into the story. So I actually ended up liking part 1, even though a bit of it was confusing, and this book, it was just really good, and I think I gave it around 4.5 stars. Not perfect, but still a little bit of a shaky start turns into a great reading experience. The next book I have is also more of a modern fantasy book. This was probably released, I don't know, a few years ago, and that would be Malice by John Gwynne. And I've got a little bookmark here because I'm actually reading it right now, and I'm a little bit more than halfway through, and I can say firsthand, well, I should be able to say firsthand for all of these books, but I can tell you that this book definitely had a rocky start for me, and not because of the writing style, because the writing style is pretty, I don't know, basic. It's just that there's so many characters that are introduced in this book that it's really hard to keep up with everyone that he introduces in the book. And so when you first start out the book, you're kind of just like, okay, I know this guy, I know this guy, I'm going to have them down, and then hopefully these other characters aren't extremely important yet. But again, once you get further into the story, you quickly get a grasp on what is going on, who these characters are, and what exactly is going on here. I'm obviously not done with the book yet. I'm only a little bit more than halfway through, but I'm pretty confident in saying that this is going to be a terrific book. Not necessarily a perfect book, not necessarily like an all-time favorite for me, but I am fairly enjoying it so far. So I do think that it was well worth pushing through that little bit of a rocky start where I wasn't quite sure what was happening. There's a lot of characters to keep track of, but I'm definitely glad I pushed through because it's a good book so far. The last book I have here is basically the first book I thought about when making this list, because a lot of people read this book or they attempt to read the book and they don't continue with the series, and it's frustrating because it's not a very good litmus test for if you're going to enjoy the series or not. So I'll go ahead and hold up the book for y'all, and that would be The Gunslinger by Stephen King, the first book in the Dark Tower series. It's Stephen King, so you know already off the bat it's going to be weird and wacky, but it's a fantasy series that's also part Western, part sci-fi, part horror. So combine all of those elements and you get a very jarring experience. And for a lot of people, what they do, they try to read this book and they either DNF it extremely quickly or they push through it and they're like, you know, that wasn't that great. I don't know if I really want to continue or not. It's kind of a meh book, maybe like a 2 or 3 star book. I might put it off for a while. But that's a shame because the second book in the series is really where it starts to pick up. That's my favorite book in the series. It's a top 5 Stephen King book for me. Fantastic, and it's a much better litmus test to see if you're going to enjoy the series, because that's where you get introduced to more of the main characters. Whereas this book, it's basically just Roland's book, and there's not too much to it other than that. And I definitely had the same experience that a lot of people had. I read this book, and it was nowhere near my favorite. I think I gave it around 3 stars, and I was like, this is weird, but I'm going to continue anyway, and I'm so glad I did, because book 2 was amazing, and then books 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 after that were all great, and one of my favorite fantasy series ever, with a very rocky start, and not even just like the first, 100 pages or so, like a lot of these books are. It's the whole book. The whole book is very jarring, and it takes a long time to get used to. But if you push past this book, and you get to book 2, that's where it really starts getting good. So those are 7 fantasy books that took a while to get used to, but once you get past kind of how jarring of an experience it can be, whether it's just from the writing style, or just from the slow pace of it, or from the sheer number of characters you have to get used to, once you push past kind of the hard part of it and get to the meat of it, and you really start to get invested, that's where it starts to get good. And it really shows that patience is a virtue. But the real question here is, do you agree with me and my picks? Do you think that the books that I picked out do take a while to get into, are a bit jarring, do have a little bit of rocky starts? Or do you not agree and you think, what are you talking about, Jake? Like, I got into these books from the first chapter. I would be impressed, I guess. And do you agree if these books were worth pushing past these rocky starts to get to the end? Did you enjoy any of these books? Or did you not enjoy these books so much and you either just didn't enjoy them or you DNF'd them? Either way, let me know down in the comments below. Also, let me know if there's any other fantasy books that I haven't mentioned here that also had rocky starts for y'all. And also, if those rocky starts led to any of your all-time favorite fantasy books. Either way, let me know down in the comments below. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for watching and have a terrific day.